One criticism I get a lot is like, but your solution is, to everything is citizens' assemblies. And I can only answer yes, because it's a systemic answer. It's not like you're going to do one citizens' assemblies for one particular problem. It's that I really want the whole system to be redesigned around the ordinary citizens instead of elected assemblies.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capital Isn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
I'm trying to record a podcast. It's not actually, sorry, you guys. I am really sorry. I'm at my parents' place in Mississippi, and there's not a great internet connection, and there's about to be a thunderstorm. And so I'm going to apologize for the terrible audio quality and the chaos in the background.
Actually, I just realized that my taping was not going, so I need to record my part just to add to the insulting joke. Anyway, go ahead with yours, and then I will record mine.
Yeah. So, in 1831, a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, traveled across America. His alleged mission was to study the prisons and penitentiaries in the United States, but he was more interested in studying how the young American democracy worked. As a result of his trip, a few years later, he wrote Democracy in America, a famous book and a masterpiece in political science. So today we're going to interview the modern version of Tocqueville. She is Hélène Landemore, a political scientist at Yale and the author of two important and quite brilliant books, Democracy Reason, Politics, Collective Intelligence, and the Rule of the Many, and Open Democracy, Reinventing Popular Rule for the 21st Century.
Some of our listeners would wonder why an economic podcast like ours is interested in political theory, and in particular on something so extravagant and esoteric as the epistemological foundation of democracy. First of all, there's a very direct and important connection between the theory of information aggregation in markets and the epistemological case for democracy. Second, the interview we did last February with Martin Wolf stimulated our interest on how we can improve democracy to make it less corruptible by vested interests.
In her 2012 book, Democratic Reason, Hélène challenges the idea that leadership by the few is superior to leadership by the masses. She believes that the collective intelligence is superior to the intelligence of any one leader. And so the trick is to find ways to involve more people and aggregate their contributions. In her 2021 book, she posits that this can be done by instituting some novel forms of non-electoral democratic representation, such as local assemblies or mini-publics, where citizens chosen by lottery would deliberate on and enact policies and laws.
So at first glance, this seems like a pretty crazy idea. Would you really entrust randomly selected people to govern you? But her proposal is more complex. It implies that these people spend a lot of time deliberating with the proper support of experts and the like. So this is not a system of direct democracy, but a system of delegated democracy with a different form of delegation system.
Luigi, before we talk about her interview, I wanted to ask you a bit more about something that you said, which is that there is a very direct and important connection between the theory of information aggregation in markets and the epistemological case for democracy. Can you explain that a little bit?
So the reason why most economists believe that markets have a superior ability to allocate resources over central planning is the fact that information is diffuse. And markets provides both a way to aggregate this information and also a way to delegate the decision where this information is. So we don't necessarily need to send a message to the central planning office of how many potatoes we need, because the price indicates that. And not only the price indicates that for the person who is going to supply potatoes, which is the farmer. So the farmer just looks at the price and makes the decision based on the localized information he or she has and the aggregate information it transmitted by prices. You can think about markets as a better way to allocate resources.
So would it be going too far to say that if you're a believer in the wisdom of markets, then you should be a believer in Landemore's theories?
This is the part that is intriguing. She makes an explicit reference to that literature, and she does say there is a wisdom of the crowd. There is a collective intelligence that you need to aggregate. If you can aggregate it properly, you get better outcomes. So, we can decide that democracy is a good thing for moral reasons, but these days not a lot of people think that democracy is good because it delivers good outcomes. What she's saying, at least what I understand she's saying, is look, the reason why it's not delivering good outcome is because it's not really democracy in the way we would like it to have. We need to make it democracy more democratic, or better say, we need to make our institutions more democratic in order to deliver the benefits of this collective intelligence. So in your book, Democratic Reason, you have a beautiful analogy that is very reminiscent of Hayek. And you're saying, suppose we're all in a maze, and to get out of the maze, we need a lot of clues, and different people have different ability to get those clues right. Which system would you pick to decide whether at every cross you go right or left? You make an epistemological case for democracy by saying the best system is a democratic system where you gather all the information. As an economist, I'm a little bit skeptical because you seem to mix two things. One is how to aggregate information and how to delegate the decision process. So I can see a world in which you appoint a very clever guy to make the decision, and that this guy elicits the information from the public, and in so doing maybe reduce some of the cost of the decision-making process. Can you sort of say why I'm wrong?
Well, I think because the maze metaphor has its limits, and one of them is not to perhaps be clearer about the distinction between information and the sort of cognitive processes that go into making sense of that information and turning it into an enriched material for decision making. And my sense is that even with the best of intention and the smartest people at the top, they still form a bottleneck in terms of the way that mass of information is processed, and they will have blind spots. And that's the main argument, that, you can give them all the information you want, they still might be blind to its meaning in a particular context and for a particular purpose. In France, we've had the Yellow Vest movement, right? And supposedly our decision makers are from the best elite schools. They've even commissioned bodies of experts to recommend solutions. They even had an institution that organizes public debates, think about energy policies and write reports. And yet they kind of failed to take into account that information properly because they chose to apply very indiscriminately this carbon tax the fall 2018. And because I think, they all came from the same background, very educated, urban, wealthy, not really dependent on their cars to go around in Paris, where they live for the most part. So then they didn't quite anticipate the sort of lived-in experience of having to pay €5 more at the pump every month. And so I think there's a sort of discrepancy between what they think they know and what they actually know. So which takes us to this question of political knowledge and its definition. And my view is that it's not just information, it's also how you the kind of cognitive processes you bring to it and how you turn that into something richer and multidimensional, and that has not just factual components, but also moral and ethical components.
Now, you're really pushing in your second book, Open Democracy, for a more participatory democracy. One question I have is, maybe a lot of people don't want to participate. And this is, in the last presidential election, which was, I think, the highest level of participation since 1900, we only had 2/3 of the people voting for president. And so 1/3 decided not to. And this was a record, because if you go down the pecking order, the participation is even lower. So what does it give you faith that people will spend their weekend deliberating when they're not even willing to spend 5 minutes to vote?
Because it's not the same participation at all, for one thing. I think people are fed up with modes of participation that don't seem to translate into actual agency and impact. And I think that explains a lot of the, abstention you see during election cycles. And second of all, my model is not meant to turn, our systems into direct democracy where you'd have to spend all your evenings debating and talking and becoming informed at the expense of your family or your job or your personal pursuits. It's meant instead to encourage focused, intermittent, regular, but not that frequent participation in deliberative assemblies where you have the incentives and the sort of structure to reach an enlightened sort of perspective and come together as a group to make decisions or at least recommendations that have an impact. And what gives me empirically the confidence that this can be done, I would say the Citizens' Assembly that I just co-governed in France, it's called the Citizens' Convention on the End of Life. And we started with 185 citizens. And we asked them to sacrifice 9 weekends of 2 days and a half over a short period of time, 4 months. And by the end, how many do you think we still had in the group? Well, we had 184. Everybody stayed. And even to me, this was a huge surprise. But this level of commitment, I didn't even expect. And I'm optimistic about those things. So there has been close to 600 cases of mini-publics, involving randomly selected citizens in the world at this point.
This is fascinating. Can you describe us a little bit more how these things work? And particularly, how do you provide views to this assembly? Who has the right to decide what evidence is provided in front of them? Who are the experts that give the information? What kind of menu they receive in their daily routine?
So in the French Convention, I'd say a specificity of the French Convention, there have been two at this point, has been to make explicit the fact that there is a governance, that there are people in charge of shaping the proceedings. And those people are not members of the convention, they are appointed from the outside by the government. And I was one of them in the last convention, but during the first one, those were, experts of climate change, they were experts of participatory democracy, think tank leaders. And so there's a worry that there's a form of paternalism that sort of creeps in. And I worry about that very much as well. But my observation and my experience, my direct experience of being on the governance committee is that after a while, there's in fact a co-construction that happens in the sense that the citizens very quickly are asking for control and co-responsibility over the process. For us, it happened during session 3. The first 2 sessions, everybody very shy, but then very quickly the questions come in. Why this expert? Why is the facilitation preventing us from, spending more time discussing about this or about this? So the difficulty though, and I'll admit that we're still in the stages where we're still figuring this out, is that there are people, including on the governance committee, that resist the idea that citizens can have leadership in the process in ways that are not collective, right? But having leadership when you're a group of 184, how does that work, right? You can't have 184 agreeing on everything, but if you let people self-select, are they really representative of the larger group? Are we following this minority versus this minority? So how do we make sure that when there's leadership from the citizenry, it's truly representative? And it's tricky. The first convention on climate had representatives, I call them representatives. Some of my colleagues would disagree because all that vocabulary is very much in flux and controversial, but I would call them representatives of the citizens on the governance committee so that they can lodge complaints and make requests on behalf of the rest of the group in a way that's seen as legitimate by the others. And usually they're picked on the basis of random selection, not elections, right? To sort of stay in keeping with the very principle of this convention, which is that we bring together randomly selected citizens. Everybody's equal, everybody's got an equal chance to be picked, etc. The second convention on end of life decided not to include citizens on the governance committee, but we had 2 representatives of the previous convention on that governance committee, so they brought that sort of lived-in experience of citizens having gone through a first process. And we had office hours and we had moments of, consultation with the group. They made a lot of demands. They wanted certain experts. They wanted to be present during press conferences. And by the end, I think the process was much more co-constructed than truly sort of directed and governed by just us, the small group of experts. I do feel somewhat illegitimate in having been put in this position of power. I do feel like you need people to coordinate the whole process, but do we need people to actually govern it? I'm not sure. And if anything, it should be a self-governance rather. Amazingly, we don't know how, for example, the Greek boule of 500, ordinary Greek citizens ruled itself. We just don't know. Like I haven't found anything that tells us, oh, they had these rules and procedures to have an orderly debate and deliberation about topics, right? So you have to have rules and someone who's like deciding the procedures and the pace and brings in the experts, etc. And right now we're struggling a bit. I think there's this core responsibility that's naturally evolving with citizens asking for more and more say, but at the same time we don't really have the representative structures in place that we need for this to really work out. And so these assemblies are not sovereign the way parliaments are. And my big question is actually, okay, how do we get there? Okay, and the additional question is, should we, right? In my view, we should, but there are a lot of people who think that absolutely not, we should not get there.
So 2 follow-up questions here. One slightly cynical. Aren't you attempting to override human nature in a way, given that in every group someone rises to a leadership position? Maybe it's the loudest person in the room, maybe it's the most aggressive person in a room, but I think I've watched Survivor a few times. Doesn't someone always sort of start to take over the island? How do you override human nature? And then a second question, if the key to this is the makeup of the governance committee, how do you pick the people on the governance committee? To back up Luigi's question one stage further, there's some selection of people going on by somebody at some point. And how do you make that as honest and transparent as possible?
Okay, so on the human nature question, I think you're not so much resisting human nature as channeling it. The point is not to prevent leadership from emerging. On the contrary, we build on it throughout. In fact, there are natural leaders that emerge, and they're recognized as such by the other citizens. They're very much respected. They play an absolutely crucial role. But at the same time, we don't try to do is sort of entrench the role of these natural leaders and elevate them above the rest. Because when that was tried, and that was tried during the Convention on Climate, it backfires big time. The other citizens do not want that to happen. They want the leaders to lead where they're needed and necessary. So in improving the quality of the conversation, in making excellent points, in making suggestions, in taking the responsibility of drafting certain crucial parts of the final report, like the manifesto or things like that. When it came to talking to Macron on April 6th, right, where they had to choose who to send to the podium, only 2 really had time to say anything. So they had to pick 2. And we asked them, okay, who do you want to choose, right? Because we asked ourselves, do we choose or we let them choose? We said we have to let them choose at this point. I'm telling you, we lost power as we went along. And we thought, who? And it was really a big question. None of us knew what they would choose because they had the choice between a sort of liquid democracy system where they were able to identify the natural leaders among themselves and entrust them with that task. And they said, or choose based on random selection, which would be more in keeping with the spirit of the whole thing. And they asked us, which we hadn't planned, they said, we need some time to debate about the merits of one method versus the other. So we gave them that time. And this was one of the most interesting conversations, actually. Some people said, well, they only have 10 minutes. They need to give a really smart and concise account of what we did in this convention. So we need to choose people who speak well and can sort of be at the level of Macron, right? And then other people said, no, that's not the point. The point is that Macron needs to see France in its diversity. And, there are regular people in there that don't speak well, that have a strong accent, who make mistakes. And then other people said, well, it's also about ending with the principle with which we started, which is random selection and everything. And so at the end, they actually chose random selection. But they didn't do it systematically because when it came to choosing people to write the manifesto, they chose liquid democracy. When it came to talking to the nation, addressing the nation during the televised part of the concluding session, they chose, again, liquid democracy. And it was very clear that the people they wanted were not the most outspoken, the loudest, the most visible, the one that journalists like, but actually the quiet voices that are like the good students, the hardworking bees in the group. So I don't know, it's just human nature, you can't change it. You just have to work with it, but you don't have to accept that, because they are natural leaders, let's give them free rein to govern us and make all the decisions. I mean, this is something I've heard among, circle of political theorists who are like, those people exist and they need an arena, and so let's channel their passions for the common good by letting the ambitious access positions of power. And I think, no, that's very dangerous, actually. So I think we should have leaders, but doesn't mean they have to have the decision power.
So your mechanism is clearly inspired by juries in the United States. But in the United States, juries are segregated, and until they finish deliberating, they are anonymous. I don't expect you to have the same system, especially if this lasts for a month. And so my concern, if they need to make decision about big things, what are the risks of them being bought off by the private interests? In this is, we now discovered that Justice Thomas was receiving lavish gifts to travel around the world. And sure, it was a friend, but it's not out of the question that the friends might be able to influence a bit, especially if you spend a lot of time in the same place with these people. So the moment you pick 150 people to decide on climate change, Exxon will be there the next day. So how do you prevent this from happening?
First of all, I think that it's important to recognize that this is what's happening in electoral context, right? For elected assemblies, that they have this kind of problem of lobbying, borderline corruption. So I'm not saying this can't happen for randomly selected citizens' assemblies. We're all worried about that, especially as these assemblies become more and more empowered. But there are some structural features that make them, I think, a lot more resilient. One, the fact that the people in there are randomly selected. So you can anticipate ahead of time who's going to be in the assembly, the way you can sort of build long-term relationships with elected officials that stay in power for 20 years. The second feature is that people who are randomly selected do not depend on campaign contributions to access their position of power. I think it's happened a little bit. In fact, in the climate convention, there were attempts, definitely, but then you can build maybe firewalls that prevent certain contacts from happening except within the walls of the Citizens' Assembly and under very specific conditions. You can have an ethics committee supervising the watching over the proceedings. And we also have in the structure safeguards that are structural, like there are guarantors that are present, impartial guarantors, we call them, that are appointed precisely to make sure there's no capture that happens, or corruption, or manipulation, and that citizens have a voice throughout and can be heard, etc., etc. You know, I don't think there's any system that's bulletproof, but this system presents certain advantages. The final advantage I would mention is the fact that the term limits are really short so far, right? It's 9 months at the very most. And finally, I'd say it's the peer accountability or internal accountability of all these people. I'm afraid electoral systems tend to select for power-hungry people. You know, I'm not going to say psychopath, but I mean, there are certain psychological traits that seem to be overrepresented in these assemblies. And I don't think that's the case in randomly selected assemblies where you have people who've had very humble lives. You know, it doesn't go to the head as much as you'd think it would. I think that the evidence so far is that it would not be more of a risk than in elected assemblies, and it's probably much less of a risk, actually.
Back to your first comment, you talked about the question of incentives and how important it was to get the incentives right. What are the right incentives, both for the participants and for the mediators? How do you get people to want to overcome the fun of inflamed passion and replace it with the what's less fun, which is cool, calm reason?
I think you want to make sure that even the person that's the most shy, the most disillusioned with politics has an incentive to care and be present and engage. Because when we're missing those voices, we're missing information, but not just information. We're missing perspectives and a kind of thinking that leads to bad decisions. So when it's missing, it's important to think of those spaces as empowered, joyful, and rewarding, and also as costless as possible for the participants. So, for example, one very important feature of citizens' assembly is that citizens are paid an honorarium for their time. It's around 80 euros per day in the case of the French Convention. We also make sure that they have sort of conditions for well-being, mental and physical, right? They eat well, they have a psychologist available from day one, because of course, especially on end of life, a lot of stories were heartbreaking and very difficult emotionally, and we were very, very worried about what that could do to them. We probably didn't do as much as we could have done. You know, we wanted to involve, artists. And so at the end, we had one concert, which was fantastic. And we had one dancing party that lasted until 1 a.m., which was the latest that it could go anyway. So, I think people bonded enormously. So I think one of the rewards is the friendship. And I'm even tempted to say the love between the participants. And it's something that I'd personally never experienced in my life, really. I think you get this sense of civic friendship, civic speak love only in dire straits, like, for example, when there's a terrorist attack and all of a sudden people bond together and try to help each other and donate money and time and energy to a common cause. And then it sort of disappears again. And in elected arenas, you just have hatred and contempt. And I mean, I'm sure there are some friendships, in the margins of these things, but when with the public, the visible part of it is all about agonism and adversarial, sort of exchanges and conflict. And it's not pretty. It's especially been very ugly on this pension reform recently in France. And when you see that as a citizen, you're just disgusted and just want to turn away and have nothing to do with it. And what we saw in our convention was completely the opposite. And I sound like I probably sound like I'm super sectarian and brainwashed, but no, I'm telling you, these environments are transformative. So during the last session, we asked citizens to reflect, the 184 to reflect about their process and what they took from it. And a member of the minority, so very vehement anti-euthanasia and assisted dying leader, said to the group, I want to thank the 75% who voted for, the euthanasia and assisted dying, for giving the minority 50% of the speaking time and 50% of the space in the final report. So there was this acknowledgement that, yes, we disagree, but we're in it together and we're going to work so that we stay together until the end and we all vote on the final product as kind of as one. It was, I think the final report got 92% of approval, including from people who disagreed with some of the recommendations. You also had people who just said, I love you to the rest of the group, even though they also had been in the minority. And you had people who asked for forgiveness for the harsh words they had exchanged. And so these are things that you don't get to live, especially in France, which is a country that is pretty cynical and suspicious, and at least the mood is the mood that I'm familiar with is absolutely not what I'm describing right now.
So perhaps this is a concept that is uniquely U.S., or perhaps it's a concept that has been unfortunately taken from the business world and applied to the world of politics, but that's accountability, that you have a leader so that you have somebody who's accountable. So is that a valid concept, this idea of accountability resting with a single person? And if it is a valid concept that you need accountability, how do you re-engineer that for a different decision-making process where it doesn't rest on one person?
So accountability, it would be good to have a clear definition of what that word means, because people mean by it too many things. They mean by it sanctionability, like the ability to punish or reward someone with power or with the removal of power from power when they do stuff you don't like. But they also mean the ability to give accounts. That's more of the etymological meaning, actually. Like, can you justify the policies and laws you've implemented? What's the accountability of assemblies that are based on lot? You won't have the sanctionability in the sense of removing them from power, but you could have a sanctionability through, again, maybe ethics commission that make sure that if somebody engages in untoward behavior like corruption or things like that, they're actually removed from the convention, for example. In terms of giving accounts, I think they're uniquely equipped to do that. In fact, in the report, which is 170 pages long, you have all the arguments and reasons as to why they supported euthanasia and assisted dying under some conditions. And so you've got a lot more accountability, I think, in that report than in the sort of arguments that politicians, make or the sort of justification they spin according to polls and what's going to sound good. And it's a lot more sincere, I think, in these assemblies. And then accountability in terms of doing good and avoiding harm. I also think it's in the structure of those assemblies that they bring in so many different viewpoints, so many perspectives, that it does protect them from making huge mistakes and I think doing harm, and it helps them do good, actually. For example, there are homeless people that have participated in these conventions. So if, say, the conversations is about housing, it's very hard for people who are, landlords to look in the eye somebody who's, susceptible of eviction or something like that and say, well, we have to do it this way because otherwise I'm losing money. Their sheer presence, their physical presence, changes the nature of the conversations.
Your sort of method is so interesting that one wonders, where do you stop? Should we apply that to firms? Should we apply them to universities? Should we apply them to hospitals?
It's a very good question, because one criticism I get a lot is like, but your solution is, to everything is citizens' assemblies. And I can only answer yes, because it's a systemic answer. It's not like you're going to do one citizens' assemblies for one particular problem. It's that I really want the whole system to be redesigned around the ordinary citizens instead of elected assemblies. I think we got the design wrong in the 18th century. And if we have to change things, it's going to take a radical reshaping and a set of reforms that run deep, and it's not just at the political level, but the economical level as well. And frankly, I think that's why unions and parties are so unpopular right now. It's because they're still based on those elitist logic of, the people, who are the most active and visible and talk the loudest are going to be on top of those institutions. And I think you could introduce some random selection in the way leaders of unions are selected, in the way the direction of hospitals is selected so that nurses have access. So I think you plant that seed, and I think you can grow, all kinds of things that would be very good for all of us.
Thank you so much for your time. This was really interesting, and thank you for your work, and thanks for coming on our show.
Thank you so much.
Will everyday investors and shareholders shake the foundations of capitalism by seeking a greater voice in corporate boardrooms? Join Chicago Booth's Rustandi Center and Stiegler Center in partnership with the Financial Times for a virtual event on June 14th. Shareholder Democracy: Is a Revolution on the Horizon? Is the second in the Unpacking ESG series featuring Chicago's Luigi Zingalis and University of Pennsylvania's Lisa Fairfax. The panel will be moderated by the FT's Simon Mundy. Register at chicagobooth.edu/unpackingESG.
So did she convince you? Or maybe a better way to ask that question is, how skeptical were you going in? Because it sounds to me like you're inclined to agree with her on some level. And so did you, maybe I'll ask that as a two-part question. Did you need convincing? And if so, did she convince you?
You are very perceptive, because I feel I'm a bit biased, and for two reasons. One is that she is trying to improve the democracy in the direction of making it more democratic. These days, I'm afraid that people are trying to go in the opposite direction, to say that, we should not let people vote, and or if we vote, we should disregard the vote if it doesn't turn out the way we want. I have to say with some disappointment that our former guest, Vivek Ramaswamy, who, as you know, is running for president, came out recently with a proposal to actually eliminate the vote from people between 18 to 25, I think, unless they either do 6 months of civic service or they pass a test on the civicness, which is generally required if you want to get American citizenship. I'm nervous when people start going in the direction of reducing the voting rights. And I think that this is a trend, and she's actually backing that trend. And I like people who back a trend. And second, she runs against all the stereotype of the French intellectual. I think the French intellectual tend to be very Cartesian. We know what is the right thing, and from the top we distribute to the masses. She actually believes in the wisdom of the crowd. And so she is, to me, like a modern Tocqueville. And there is nobody like a foreigner to appreciate a great institution inside the United States. And I think she does appreciate great institutions, including the American jury system. I think for many Europeans, the American jury system seems crazy. But I think that there is a wisdom of that we often ignore.
So what do you make of the fact that there is this, I'm going to call it an anti-democratic strain running through the very founding of America? And I was thinking, as we were talking about this, I was thinking about a couple of interesting quotes. One is by Alexander Hamilton. He said this: "The ancient democracies in which the people themselves deliberated never possessed one feature of good government. Their very character was tyranny, their figure deformity. When they assembled, the field of debate presented an ungovernable mob, not only incapable of deliberation, but prepared for every enormity. And then there was another one by this isn't actually a direct quote, but it's James Madison, who too believed that direct democracies like the assembly in Athens unleashed popular passions that overcame the cool deliberative reason prized above all by Enlightenment thinkers. It raises two questions for me. One is why there was this almost anti-democratic sentiment running through, or this skepticism of the people running through the very country that was supposedly founded to express the will of the people. And then secondly, is there any truth to that? Do you have, when you have the process she is proposing, do you have more emotion and less reason? And does that, if you do, does that necessarily lead to a worse outcome?
First of all, let me break it to you, but the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic. And the founding fathers were not democratic at all. They were actually Republicans in the... And there is a long tradition of actually them opposing the government by the many, and including the electoral colleges that are still with us. Now, I am sympathetic with some of the concerns that the founding fathers had at the time. First of all, because there was no precedent of a democracy since the time of Rome, so there was a lot of uncertainty of what will work or not. And two, because the average level of education was much, much lower. This idea that only an elite could be better informed to govern, I think was more justified then than it is certainly now. But what I find it intriguing of what Hélène is saying is that it's not really governance by the mob, because she actually puts something in between, let's say, a referendum and the people. So let me make an example very, very clear. One of the biggest objections people have about the referendum is the Brexit referendum. Now, I don't think you should judge institutions on the basis of necessarily whether you like the outcome or not, but that was a poorly conceived referendum to begin with. It was not a discussion about proposal A versus proposal B, was a discussion between the existing reality and a dream, versus situation like in Ireland, where when it came to determine, for example, on the law governing abortion, etc., they had one of these mini publics that Hélène talks about, deciding what kind of formulation is more likely to have an agreement of a majority, but then they put that proposal to a decision of the public at large. So there is a form of direct democracy, but it's not complete direct democracy based on the exploitation of some feelings by some leaders. I think that the fear, in my view, of the direct democracy is only when you have some very powerful leaders who are very good at manipulating the crowd, and they use this manipulation for perverse objectives. Things about Mussolini, things about Hitler, things about a lot of the dictators of the 20th century. So Hélène is not going for this plebiscitarian democracy. She has something in between, which I find it very intriguing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it is a chicken and an egg question. In other words, in America, so few people show up to vote. You saw what happened in Chicago recently. The mayoral election, I think we had, 30% voter turnout? It's tragic. And you could say that proves that her system, her ideas won't work here because people don't care enough. But of course, the counter could be people don't care enough because they feel like they don't actually have a voice and what they do doesn't matter. And so her system, her ideas could also be a way more broadly to fix apathy, because if people start to realize they have a voice in at least some aspects of this, then maybe they'll care more about the rest of it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that when you have low participation, the only one participating for sure are the people with a very strong interest at stake. So I think the reason why we have a huge police problem in America is because mayors don't rule over the police, is the police ruling over the mayor. Why? Because the police is very active in the election. So I think the problem of low participation is really not only reducing the value of democracy, but really almost destroying its essence. And the idea behind this democracy with this mini public, once you are chosen to do this role, most people take it incredibly seriously. So if you are one of the 100 people who have to decide the new law about euthanasia in the United States, or even just a proposal that would go to a referendum on euthanasia, this is incredibly empowering, and most people take it very seriously. Now, if you are simply one of the people who vote for somebody who's not going to listen to what you do, etc., you end up not voting. But in that particular case, I think people are more civic-minded that we make them to be, but not as much as to be martyr and do everything that we expect them to do.
Have you ever wondered what goes on inside a black hole? Or why time only moves in one direction? Or what is really so weird about quantum mechanics? Well, then you should listen to Why This Universe. On this podcast, you'll hear about the strangest and most interesting ideas in physics, broken down by physicists Dan Hooper and Shalma Wegsman. If you want to learn about our universe, from the quantum to the cosmic, you won't want to miss Why This Universe, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network.
I still do worry, though, and I think she agrees with this, but what gives me pause is that even in a supposed open forum where everybody has a voice, the rules about who speaks when and how people speak and what's allowed to be spoken about and who shapes the conversation can really play a huge role in dictating the outcome of even something that appears to be very, very much driven by equality and very participatory. And so I think that's my biggest concern, is that her system could be not just hijacked by a figure in a time of passion like a Mussolini or a Hitler, but also that on more seemingly banal decisions that it could be hijacked just by the very setup. But I think she is very aware of that.
To me, is where all the bodies are buried, because the kind of news that you feed and the kind of agenda you set. She even said, which I thought was interesting and valuable, that you have some psychologists on the side to help people. But, psychologists are also very good at manipulating people. So if a big decision is at stake, there is the risk of the psychology manipulating that on the backside. And as you pointed out, there is very little accountability, at least in one sense of the word. And she claims that the way you make it difficult is, number one, that these people serve for a limited period. So it's more difficult for any vested interest to capture, because you need to set up the system. And two, there is some peer accountability when you work there. At some level, I buy how effective this is in practice. That's what I'm nervous, and particularly I'm nervous because of this infrastructure. If the psychologist is a psychologist that works there all the time, then that psychology will be incredibly influential in all the decision, and all the vested interests will go through the psychologist.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I think of the sophistication of the lobbying mechanisms in America and the way so many of them are so shadowy and take just deep excavation by the press, even at the best of moments, to figure out who's funding what and why things are happening the way they are, I just worry that our country is too much of an expert in the dark arts for something like this not to be hijacked.
I agree. On the positive side, however, I think it is a system to reduce the cognitive load of democracy, because in an ideal world, we like people to opine on everything, because if there is this collective wisdom, that's the best way to do it. However, having everybody involved into everything is super, super costly. If you force people to vote on everything, they are going to be probably not as informed as you would like. The idea of randomly selecting some people, at least use that to coalesce a common proposal, I think is a very good idea that should be experimented with. It's not just in the political arena. I was thinking, as you know, I'm a big supporter of corporate democracy. But one of the challenges that people have is there is so much diversity within the shareholders, even within the workers, within customers, that it's very hard to convey that information to companies in any constructive way. I think the idea of randomly selecting either workers or customers or even shareholders to bring a coherent proposal on some moral issues. I was discussing with my students about the issue of Disney and Ron DeSantis. The interesting part is that most of the pressure against the law that DeSantis approved was coming from a subsidiary of Disney, Pixar, where the creative people are. And to my understanding, most of these people live in California. Okay? So you have a group of employees of California pushing the Florida employees, company operating in Florida, to change the law in Florida. And so I challenged my students, said, what if the majority of employees are in China and we have the Chinese employees forcing a US company to lobby to change a US law. How would you feel about it? And of course, there was a lot of strange reaction.
Oh my goodness, that is absolutely fantastic. And it does make me think maybe we should do a separate episode on Disney versus DeSantis, actually. Maybe you and I should just discuss it. I think we should have some fun with that one. So I'm going to wrap up any comments I have to say just by saying that I'm really glad we did this. I'm really glad we talked to her, and I'm really glad to think about it just because it opened my eyes to possibilities. I'm not sure they can become actualities in America, but you never know. It takes getting the possibility out there first, right?
Yeah, I think that actually I got convinced that this is something to experiment in companies. For example, if you want to know what your workers want, think about the issue of do we like this law or we don't like this law? Do we accept that a company lobbies in this favor or not? After all, ironically, the Citizens United decision was based on a conception of corporate governance, which is not the one we have. And the justices said that the reason why corporations should have a voice is because simply represent the stakeholders that are involved, including the employees and the consumers. The problem is that there is no way to actually listen to that in any organized way. And really sampling all of them and make sure they are informed, etc., is extremely expensive. In the place where there are the unions, you can delegate the unions, but the unions can have a particular agenda. So selecting some workers in a random way and giving them a bunch of information to choose the problem and then make a proposal to the board, for example, I think that would be really, really a good way to experiment with this.
I love that idea. I think it is doable within corporations, and that makes a ton of sense to me because I never really focused on that language in Citizens United until you just said it, but it strikes me as completely false. I think corporations are totally undemocratic. Per the example you just gave of what's happening with Disney, I think they are subject to being hijacked by the loudest voices in the room. I think they're at the whim of the shareholders who do care and carry the loudest stick, and I think they're all, in the end, ultimately subject to the bottom line, and so they're not democratic at all. And putting in place something like this would be a really interesting challenge it might be a way to make stakeholder capitalism more than just a phrase, something that actually has some bite to it.
Capitalism is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Leah Caesarine, with production assistance from Utsof Gandhi, Sebastian Burka, Chris Wheat, and Brooke Fox. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for Capitalism wherever you get your podcasts.